I'm back up here for one reason and one reason only, and that's to introduce the next person who's going to stand here. The first time I ever saw Frank de la Teja was when I started going to Texas State Historical Association meetings on a regular basis. I came once from Connecticut in the 70s, and I came once in the 80s, but I came again in 1994, and I haven't missed one yet. And I was sitting there anonymously, because no one knew who the heck I was, and I saw these three people embracing, abrazos everywhere. And it was Jack Jackson, the late artist and historian, and Ana Carolina Castillo Krim, the historian of the De Leon family, and Frank de la Teja. And I said to myself, as I watched these people laugh and hug and talk, these people know how to have a good time. And that's why I've never missed another Texas State Historical Association meeting. So in addition to your support of San Jacinto, I highly recommend the next time, even if you don't want to travel, the next time the TSHA comes to Houston. When will that be, Frank? Do you know?
Maybe 3-4 years.
Maybe 3 or 4 years from now. We met in Houston recently. But go to San Antonio, go to Dallas, go to Fort Worth, go even as far as El Paso, over there in Baja, New Mexico, and get involved with the Texas State Historical Association. There are a lot of really interesting people. I think it's the best convention in America. Frank de la Teja, as you can see on your program, was appointed by Governor Perry as the first official state historian of Texas. And any official state historian of Texas has an enormous amount of work and no salary. And there have been 3, but Frank was the first. We now are in the midst of our third official state historian of Texas, and they go around doing missionary work, telling people how important Texas history is. Frank is the former head of the history department at Texas State University at San Marcos, known under a different name when Lyndon Johnson was there. Frank is one of the most active and able people doing Texas history, and he's a volunteer Texan who came from Cuba by way of New Jersey. And I want you to give him the welcome he deserves.
So my first job, and I want to do it very quickly because I want to give him as much time as possible. He's got a PowerPoint presentation he wants to present to you, is to introduce Nicolas Canellos, who heads one of the perhaps unrecognized, unappreciated gems in the academic and the scholarly publishing world, Arte Público Press, which is part of an institution which I think is underappreciated here locally, even though we're in a way rivals, but not really. And that's the University of Houston, which has got a lot of really great people and is doing some wonderful things, particularly with regard to Latinos, Mexican Americans. And so Nicolas as the director of the press, has been involved in a couple of major national projects to recover the historical heritage of Latinos, Mexican Americans. And so he's going to come up and talk about what the press does, its role in preserving and promoting our collective heritage. And so with no further ado, Nicolas.
Thanks, Frank. Recovering the U.S. Latino heritage, basically, is a project to find, preserve, and make accessible all of the written culture, every single written document created by Latinos before 1960 and what became the United States. As part of that job, we are, of course, recovering Tejano history. And we've come a long way in recovering hundreds of thousands of documents. We publish some of them. We publish books, but we also have very, very large databases of text that are available online through various distributors of digitized text, and that's everything from proclamations to whole books. These are the various divisions of the project, including creating a master bibliography, and we have recovered something like 1,400 newspapers published before 1960. We've made 440 of them available through Redex, an online database of newspapers. You can put somebody's name in there or an event, and it'll bring you up everything that was written about it in the Spanish language and Hispanic newspapers. And that includes some of the first newspapers that were ever published by Latinos in the United States, such as El Mississippi, which was published in 1808 in New Orleans, and the first one west of the Mississippi, which some of you may know as La Gaceta de Texas, published in Nacogdoches in 1813, part of the revolutionary movement, for the first Republic of Texas, that some people don't know about. This is where the first printing press came to Texas and west of the Mississippi at the Old Stone House in Nacogdoches. That's where La Gaceta de Texas was typeset. We also have gone forward and published all kinds of newspapers through Revolutionary Times, Immigrant Times, and lots of material by women, including newspapers written and published by women like La Voz de la Mujer, published in the teens of the 20th century in El Paso. Many newspapers in Texas were founded by the followers and by Ricardo Flores Magón himself when he came to San Antonio during the spark for the Mexican Revolution. A lot of the women's newspapers formed part of the Magón group, including Teresa Villarreal's newspaper El Obrero, which was published in San Antonio. Her sister also, Teresa, her sister Virginia, also published newspapers in Texas. Religious faith is a sub-project that we collect all the documents from all of the religions, including Sephardic Jews, Methodists, Presbyterians, etc. This is a magazine that was published in El Paso for many, many years, from the 19th century way up through the 20th century. We have memoirs of religious figures and secular figures. One that you may have known that was very, very popular, went into something like 20 editions, the memoir of Jose Policarpo Rodriguez, who was a frontiersman in Texas and later became a minister. When you go online and look something up in one of our databases, you'll get the whole newspaper article, and they're indexed along various ways: author, theme, dates, all kinds of stuff. We also are very active out in the communities, collecting people's papers and documents, and we digitize them and make them available. We preserve them on microfilm. We preserve them at the University of Houston Special Collections Library. We have many collections that you can visit and do research with. We'll also ask you, if you're thinking about your family papers and photographs, etc., to contact us, and we'll help you preserve them. But in our program, we just don't preserve, and we just don't hold libraries. We also make sure that people find out about it, and we get it out. We make sure that it's accessible to people in one form or another. We publish books on different subjects relating to all of Latinos in the United States, but especially to Tejanos. I'm sorry we can't read every line here. I've got 10 minutes. One of our great collections is the Leonor Villegas de Magnon collection. Up on your left top of the screen, that's Leonor Villegas de Magnon. She was an activist at the turn of the 19th century, 20th century, and she was an educated woman from northern Mexico who settled in Laredo, got educated at a college in New York, came back, was totally bilingual. When the Mexican Revolution broke out, she organized Anglo-Texas women, Mexican Texas women, and went into the revolution and became part of the Carranza army as nurses. After the war, she wrote the memoir in Spanish and couldn't get it published in Mexico. She rewrote it in English, Could not get it published in the United States. She had a whole chest, a baúl, of documents, letters with all the leaders of the revolution, and her manuscripts, and she was so mindful of her place in history that she always hired a photographer to follow her around. So we have all of her photographs. Finally, we published both versions of her memoirs, The Rebel, La Rebelde, through Arte Público Press, and we have her complete archive available. These are some of the photos when she was with the army, meeting with colonels and generals, and on the bottom left, part of their duty was to go take the bad news to families when their sons or daughters had died in battle. This is the book we published. Another collection that's very important that we have is called the Alonso Esperales Papers. He's an unsung civil rights hero that a lot of people didn't know about, but who was the founder in the 1920s and 30s of many, many civil rights organizations, including an original founder of LULAC. We acquired all of his documents from the family. They had them stored in something like 15, 20 boxes in a garage in San Antonio. They were bug-bitten and rodent-gnawed, etc., but we were able to salvage them, and they're completely available online. We preserve them, we microfilm them, and we even have conferences based on these documents where we bring experts in to study them, report on them, and we often publish books that comes out of saving those documents, saving that portion of history. This is a real-life Tejano hero that for many years, because those documents were not available, people didn't know about. We also bring together scholars to talk about all aspects of Texas history, and we publish books on that. These books are available, some of them, out in the lobby in the book exhibit, so we invite you to visit those. We also have supported the publication of Tejano history at university presses around the country. We have helped underwrite those. We have given fellowships to scholars to work during summer to do the research and the writing. This is one of the books that came out of the project at TCU Press, if I remember correctly. Our microfilms are available around the world through a distributor in Amsterdam, so people can get a look at those original documents. We work with the world's largest database publisher, EBSCO, to make all of these documents and books and photographs available at universities and libraries around the country. This is a flyer that talks about that. And ReadX is exclusive to newspapers. And what we have through ReadX is 440 newspapers published by Latinos in the United States before 1960. And you can go to the library and search for anything. Just put anybody's name in there and see what comes up. Any event, what have you. We've done exhibits around the country. We have worked with the Texas Historical Association. We work with Latin American Studies Association. We work with museums. And that's about it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Nicolas, and thank you all for coming back this afternoon. I think part of my job, although Nicolas certainly got you going, he's passionate about what he does, so it might make my task of trying to keep you awake after eating that wonderful lunch a little easier. But I'm also going to add a couple of tasks to your afternoon, and that is that there is a blue form. It's the question and answer form. If you have a question, the best way to handle it, because it's such a large room and everything, is for you to go ahead and write it down and bring it to me while Jim is talking, which is the perfect thing to do while Jim is talking. He got me in the car on the way in. I told him I'd get him back sooner or later. And then the other sheet is this yellow one, which is the evaluation form. Please don't forget to fill out an evaluation form, and you can leave it out at the front table on your way out. So I've already been introduced. I was very fortunate to get the introduction that I did from him because I never know what he's going to say about me. And I welcome you to the Antonio Menchaca portion of our program. He was a proud Texan. It's one of the things that really comes across in what he has to say. But he was also a proud Texan whose life spanned 6 different sovereignties. He was born under Spain. He became an adult under Mexico. He fought for the independence of Texas. He then embraced American citizenship. He accepted secession and the Confederacy, and he lived out the remaining years of his life once again as an American. And you can probably understand how that kind of an experience has to either leave you extremely confused, or it requires you to marshal your energies, your passions, and your loyalties and sink them into something. And I think Antonio Menchaca sank them into what his idea was of being a Texan. My comments today then are twofold, and I will first talk about I'll talk a little bit about the of Antonio's background, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the making of the book, because I'm going to shamelessly plug my book as well, even though it's not here for sale. But you can make up for it by going out on Amazon or your local bookstore and making sure that you get a copy. And the next time we see each other, I'll be more than happy to sign it. The other part then will be to reframe the events surrounding San Jacinto, or Saint Hyacinth in English, but San Jacinto in Spanish, and San Jacinto in Texan. From Menchaca's perspective, particularly the aftermath, where a very colorful, fanciful account of his encounter with the leading figures of the Texas Revolution take place. First, a bit about Antonio. Jose Antonio Menchaca was a 4th-generation Tejano, the son of Juan Mariano and Maria de la Luz Guerra. According to the parish baptismal register, Father Gavino Valdez, himself a San Antonio native, baptized the 8-day-old Antonio on January 17, 1800. Although in the years before his death in 1879, he claimed descent from the wrong first settlers of San Antonio, he was nevertheless correct that his ancestors were among the town's founders. Both his maternal great-grandfathers had been soldiers since the earliest days of the Presidio, one having come to Texas in 1718 and the other in 1722. By the way, one of them was involved in the earliest, what I have been able to find is the earliest capital murder case in Texas history, and he was on his way to Los Adaes. So those connections stretch way back, and people have been running from the law along the Camino Real for a really long time. His paternal grandfather had brought his family, including Antonio's father, to San Antonio in 1758 after his retirement from the military. And as I keep telling people, San Antonio has always been 2 things from the very beginning. 1, it has been a military town. And 2, it has been a tourist destination, even though the original tourists to San Antonio were carrying bows and arrows. They were a rowdy bunch, although they pale in comparison to some of the stuff that one sees on spring break on the news. There may not have been any Canary Islander or prominent citizens in his background, but that would not stop Antonio from making a name for himself and becoming a champion of the Tejano heritage in San Antonio. By the time that Antonio died peacefully On November 1st, 1879, he had served as interim mayor of San Antonio, held other political offices and positions, and had become well known for his active participation in the revolution. Earlier in 1879, he had been appointed a member of the Local Arrangements Committee of the Texas Veterans Association, which was to meet in San Antonio in April 1880. The annual program went on without him, and as the published proceedings tell us, in attendance were his daughters Manuela and Antonia, Mrs. J.B. Lacoste and Mrs. Antonio Nundorf, daughters of Antonio Menchaca, soldier of San Jacinto. There, to greet them when they arrived, on the left side of the stage in the meeting hall was a large portrait of Antonio Menchaca. And that portrait, as far as I know, does not survive. This is the portrait in the Henry McArdle notebooks. Henry McArdle, who painted both Dawn at the Alamo and the Battle of San Jacinto, actually took extensive notes. He wanted to make both paintings as accurate as possible. Andres Tijerina's yawning, so I know I'm in trouble. And the notebooks are available at the State Library, and this is the portrait that he had of Antonio. So he was collecting information on everybody who participated, so Antonio. His obituary in the San Antonio Express noted that one of his most remarkable characteristics was his retentiveness of memory, his stories of the war with Mexico, and of the thrilling scenes that marked the history of this city in her virginity have ever won the listener. We cannot be sure what motivated Menchaca to begin dictating his recollections, but we can reasonably speculate that, like José Antonio Navarro, he was motivated by a need to remind the newcomers, that is, the Anglo-Texans, of the Tejano legacy in Texas and of the Tejanos' partnership with the Texians in the struggle for independence. Not surprisingly, and unlike Navarro, Antonio assumes a prominent role in events much greater in scope than what the available records warrant. We cannot be sure when Antonio began dictating his recollections, but from the internal evidence in the reminiscences, it appears to have been sometime in the mid-1870s. What we do know is what James P. Newcomb tells us in his introduction to the portion of the reminiscences that he published in The Passing Show, a San Antonio weekly news magazine that appeared at the beginning of the 20th century. And it appeared, the memoirs appeared in installments from June 22nd to July 27th, 1907. Newcomb claimed to have obtained the manuscript from Antonio over a quarter century earlier. And it would have actually been a few years earlier than that, as Antonio was dictating the last portions of the recollections in 1876. Newcomb never mentions who took down Menchaca's recollections or why he took so long to do anything with them. Newcomb does assert, quote, it is evident the amanuensis, the scribe, who took down the old captain's story, put it down without coloring, and one regrets that he did not enlarge more fully upon details that are so full of historic and romantic interest. Although, of course, Menchaca did color and enlarge. As you will soon hear, it's just that he didn't do it in the part of the recollections that Newcomb worked on. For some reason, Antonio never attempted to recover the first part of the manuscript from Newcomb, who himself never attempted to follow up with Menchaca regarding any more material. James Newcomb's grandson, Pearson, subsequently claimed in 1951 that either he or his father had passed the manuscript to the San Antonio Public Library. Unfortunately, the staff at the library is unaware of its existence. San Antonio historian and genealogist Frederick C. Chabot took up the cause of the Menchaca memoirs in 1937 when he republished what had appeared in The Passing Show, including the introduction by James P. Newcomb. A companion of that text as it appears in the passing show, and the 1937, a comparison of the text as it appears in the passing show and in the 1937 edition, indicates that Chabot made significant changes to Newcomb's version, but also that Newcomb and/or the passing show staff did a very poor job of proofreading the typesetting. Changes in the 1937 edition indicate that Chabot had access to the original manuscript and compared it to the printed version. So who knows, maybe he walked out of the San Antonio Public Library with the manuscript and it never found its way back. Nevertheless, whether or not the differences represent Chabot's correction of what appeared in the passing show or his taking liberties with the text, we can't know in the absence of the manuscript, which apparently is now lost. Both Newcomb and Chabot operated under the assumption that what he contributed was the whole of Antonio's manuscript, but such was not the case. In 1950, Mrs. William Gordon Coogan Jr., who born Elizabeth Merriam, Menchaca's great-granddaughter, explained to University of Texas archivist Winnie Allen that, quote, "My father kept these handwritten papers for many years, believing that this original account would be valuable for me to have and hoping I would have occasion to sell them to the right party. While my family and I have kept them safely these many years, I do believe that a library is the best place for these, and I should be glad to sell them to you." She was, however, unable to explain to Allen how the two parts had become separated, and recommended that Allen contact Emily Lacoste, her aunt, who still lived in San Antonio. There's no record of any such meeting having taken place, so we're left with some mysteries about the manuscript. Fortunately for us, however, the very interesting unpublished part of the reminiscences is available to us and appear in the volume which Tim and I recently published with the University of Texas Press. In fact, it is that second part of the Menchaca that Menchaca fleshes out his version of events in and around San Jacinto, a part of which I wish to share with you tonight. And by the way, there's a very long section on the campaign. What Jeff was talking about early this morning, and he talks about camping at Gross's plantation and skirmishes and a whole lot of things before they actually get to the battle. The important thing is that the second part of the memoirs is the part that is both colorful and enlarged and would have pleased Newcomb to no end. It really is a marvel of storytelling. Since it goes on for some length, I don't have time to read and comment on the whole section to you, so I'm going to focus on how Menchaca manages to place himself at the center of Santa Anna's experience as a Texan prisoner in the immediate aftermath of the battle. One curious aspect of Menchaca's tale is, in fact, the contrast between the sparse description of the Battle of San Jacinto in the first part of the manuscript, what Newcomb says is unadorned, and the very detailed account of the aftermath of the battle that Newcomb did not see. Here, then, I focus on the latter part of the story, what we might call Santa Anna and me. After discussing what happens to the Mexican sick, wounded, and captured, in all of which he plays a prominent role, Menchaca makes clear his sympathies. Writing in the 1870s as a member of the Texas Veterans Association and as an individual who, as we shall see, understands that his circumstances require him to rely on the kindness of strangers, his hyper-patriotic take on San Jacinto is not surprising, and he tells us, "The Battle of San Jacinto was the most brilliant feat of arms I have ever witnessed and has immortalized Houston, his brave staff, and the Army that participated in it, and makes a beautiful page not only in the history of the then Republic of Texas, but also in the history of the United States." That statement is followed by 2 chapters in which Santa Anna is the main topic, and in which Menchaca places himself in the thick of the action. Although he does not take credit for capturing Santa Anna, he does put a unique twist on the story that cannot be corroborated elsewhere. According to Menchaca, Santa Anna was discovered by 2 Texan soldiers out on reconnaissance who, quote, spied a fine-looking man, right? A fine-looking man with a commanding personal appearance, dressed, however, in a very filthy, ragged suit with a blue cap having a leather frontpiece. He was sitting down on the ground at a little distance from 2 likely-looking young mulatto women who were parching corn to feed him and who were evidently mistresses of his. After repeated questioning, the man stated, according to Menchaca, "I am Carlo, General Santa Anna's private secretary." They told him he was a liar, that Carlo was a prisoner at the moment in General Sam Houston's camp. The problem here is that there is no other account of Santa Anna's capture, including by the men who actually carried it out and wrote accounts, that talks about 2 mulatto women, or 2 women of any kind, as being at the scene. By telling the story with these unique details, Menchaca was, in fact, appropriating the story for himself. He was adding details that he was in a privileged position to know about. So he was becoming a Texas BS artist, of which I know that you all know at least one. I have a brother-in-law who is he's the epitome of the Texas BS artist. Menchaca's next personalization of events comes in his interpretation of why Santa Anna's life was spared when he was brought into the Mexican camp. Again, he relies on popularly understood but misconceived practices and attitudes. Menchaca claims that Santa Anna stated, quote, "I am very thirsty. Will not someone bring me some water?" One of the Texans went down to the bayou and returned with a large tin cup filled with it. And Santa Anna took the cup, and as he was about to drink it, he made the Masonic sign of distress. As he did so, all the officers and men of that fraternity, General Houston among them, drew their weapons and closed around him to protect him. Menchaca, yeah, somebody's laughing, right? Menchaca would have us believe that on the 21st, the day before, it was okay for Masons to be killing other Masons, because there were Masons on both sides, right? But that on the 22nd, all the Texans would surround and protect him from anybody who was not a Mason and wanted to kill Santa Anna. And of course, again, this is an appropriation of the story. It's giving it a specific twist. It plays on people's understanding of Masons as fraternal brothers who protect each other. And it misses the fact that Houston had a very good reason for keeping Santa Anna alive, which was that he was certainly a tremendous bargaining chip and was worth a lot more alive than dead, as events proved. But for Menchaca, this, like the story of Santa Anna's capture, allows him to present unique details, to make the story his own. Menchaca then tells the story of a Texan officer who was not a Mason and who intended to kill Santa Anna, but who was successfully cooled off by Houston, Rusk, and Burleson, who Menchaca knew, all of them personally, all right? After which Santa Anna began his conversation with Houston. According to Menchaca, Houston asked Santa Anna why he did not tell his captors who he was, to which Santa Anna replied that he feared the 2 soldiers might have killed him. At this point, Menchaca once again plays his pro-American card, saying that Houston responded, quote, "Tell Santa Anna that I have no soldiers in my command. All of my brave men are honorable gentlemen who are above such brutality. And if not, they fear me too much to do a thing that I would not countenance on account of its brutality." But he did countenance the pursuit and slaughter of the Mexican soldiers the day before. So again, Menchaca may have had a very limited formal education, but he understood how ennobling the Texans served his storytelling and ennobled him as well. Not to mention what a hit this version might be with the Texas Veterans Association if it was the intended audience. I'm being rather cynical, but that's my job. Following a further bit of conversation between the two generals and further evidence of Houston's gallantry, Menchaca finds his opportunity to interject himself into the story. Quote, Santa Anna then asked Houston through Almonte if he did not have some Mexican, that is the Tejano, gentleman among his command. I, who had been standing close during the whole conversation that had occurred since Santa Anna first asked for water, stepped forward, bowed, uncovered my head, and put my left hand over my bosom, and then addressed Santa Anna thus, quote, you see before you, General Santa Anna, a Mexican, your humble servant and ready to do your bidding. He said, you're a fine-looking fellow. If nothing else, this tells you what perspective Menchaca's taking. You are a fine-looking fellow, and your face seems familiar to me. What is your name? I answered, my name, General Santa Anna, is Antonio Menchaca. He said, you are from San Antonio, are you not, Menchaca? I said, I am, sir. He then replied, Menchaca, I know you very well. I said, I know you also very well, General Santa Anna, and I remember you when you came to San Antonio with General Arredondo, and you were then a young cadet fresh from school. And it is true that Santa Anna had first been in Texas in 1813 as part of the Royalist army that defeated the Tejano insurgents at the Battle of Medina. So we go back to this morning. I said to him, by treating you kindly, that my good repute in San Antonio may not be undeserved, please tell how I can be of service to you. He replied to me, Major Menchaca, by the way, Menchaca has now given himself a promotion. He was a sergeant at San Jacinto. He replied to me, Major Menchaca, I have not tasted any food for 3 days but parched corn, and I have not had more than enough than barely to keep me alive, and I am very hungry indeed. Will you get me something to eat? I said, General Santa Anna, the provisions in the American army are very low, and we fare but little better than you have, but I will get you what I can. He said, please get me some meat and roast it with your own hands, as some of the rest of the men might try to poison me. This extraordinary conversation, which of course is recorded nowhere else, has much to offer us regarding Menchaca's continued perception of himself and the people of San Antonio as different from other Texans. Here, as opposed to elsewhere where he has been quoted as crying out during the battle that he was not a Mexican but an American, Menchaca embraces his Mexicanness. Moreover, he claims that the people of San Antonio would somehow think less of him if he did not treat a fellow Mexican with compassion. On another level, Menchaca's conceit that Santa Anna would have remembered him from events 23 years earlier, when Menchaca was a 13-year-old, and that he would have remembered a minor junior officer in the Spanish army, really stretches the bounds of credibility. And of course, there is the problem of Seguin having been the ranking Tejano officer at San Jacinto, and Menchaca having only been a sergeant at the time. It is at this point that Menchaca, in explaining how difficult Santa Anna's position was as a prisoner, provides one of the clearest indications of the fact that he and his fellow Tejanos stood apart from the other Texans at San Jacinto. Quote, during the Battle of San Jacinto, the battle cry of the Texans was, remember the Alamo. And they made me take my men, who were Mexicans, and put large pieces of white pasteboard on our hats and breasts, lest we should be mistaken for Santa Anna's men and killed. In addition to the pathos of the scene, Menchaca manages to, again, insert himself at the center of the action. For in reality, he had been a sergeant in the company of Juan Seguin, who curiously does not mention that the Tejanos had to wear any special identification during the battle. In fact, historians are completely dependent on Menchaca for this detail. The point isn't whether the detail is true or not. The point is what that detail represents, and what it represents is that Menchaca recognizes and wants Anglo-Americans to understand what a difficult position Tejanos were in. Time requires that I skip Santa Anna's court-martial, except to say that Menchaca, recollecting in the 1870s, presents a rather twisted view on how Santa Anna wound up being sent to the United States. Quote, "The court finally concluded not to kill him, but to send him as a prisoner of war to the national capital of the United States, Washington City, and present him before the president of that government to answer for the wrong he had done some of the citizens who were murdered in the Alamo." Menchaca then goes on to describe the further kindnesses he did for Santa Anna and his leading officers, helping to feed them and clean their clothes, and telling Santa Anna that he was to be sent to the United States for trial rather than being turned over to the Texan army. In return for Menchaca's efforts, Santa Anna, quote, "put his hand in his belt and pulled out a splendid watch, which he had concealed there, and offered it to me. It was a watch that cost $3,700 and had been presented to Santa Anna by the government of Mexico as a token of appreciation for his services as its president. As he extended his hand to give it to me, I motioned to him to put it back in his belt and asked him why he had offered it to me. He said, 'To pay you for the splendid supper you have given and the good news you have told me.' I said to him, 'General Santa Anna, would you insult me by saying this and offering me that watch? You are my prisoner. Were you free, you should fight for this.' I then saw tears come to his eyes, and he cried like a child. I then said, 'General Santa Anna, I do not need your watch, which is the only thing that you have of value that you have on your person. But you, who are a prisoner, do need some assistance. I have in my belt nearly $7,000 of a New Orleans bank. Take it. It may be of some service to you to pay for your servants and living when you are taken to Washington.'" At this point, we find one of only a couple of glosses to the manuscript by whoever was assisting Menchaca in recording the recollection, and it says, quote, "It showed the goodness of heart of Menchaca to be sorry for hurting Santa Anna's feelings and offering to rob himself of his last cent to give to Santa Anna." It's obvious that Menchaca was a convincing storyteller, isn't it? Menchaca then makes the story even more moving. He says, quote, "Santa Anna said I was mistaken in believing he needed any pecuniary assistance. He informed me that he had the incredibly large sum of $33 million in gold in Mexico, and his check for that amount at any time he saw to draw on it would be paid. I then left him to retire as he was late, and I saw the men who had been left to guard the baggage during the battle come in with it, as our camp was not at the same place where we had it when the battle was fought. My wallet and other baggage that had been among it turned up missing, and I lost all of my changes of clothing and linen." So he's lost everything in the world, but he's got $7,000 in his belt, okay? Not content with having met, engaged in conversation with, and assisted Santa Anna and all of the other people I've mentioned before, Menchaca goes on to meet Lorenzo de Zavala. Why not? And witnessing the exchange between him and Santa Anna. Quote, "Sunday morning, just exactly a week after the battle, I took one of the members of my company down to the bayou to wash out the shirt that I had on. As I sat on the bank waiting for it to dry, I saw a skiff coming up Buffalo Bayou in the direction from Galveston, and as it came close to me and the person spoke to me, his face resembled the countenance of young Zavala, so closely that I knew it must be his father. I said to him, 'How do you do, Don Lorenzo Zavala?' And he replied, 'I am very well.'" What he says about Zavala is not true, but it does paint a colorful picture. Quote, "It was Zavala Sr., who had been the vice president of the Mexican Republic, but he had been banished by Santa Anna from Mexico and had to work in the streets of London and Paris. When he reached those cities, he was sent off in such destitute circumstances." Zavala, though, was a statesman and a scholar and was warmly welcomed by the Texans because he espoused their cause. Sam Houston fired a grand salute with his cannon when Zavala landed and went down with his officers, followed by Santa Anna, to the side of the water to meet him. Zavala and Santa Anna were, of course, bitter enemies, but the latter thought it just as well to be polite, as their fortunes were now reversed. And so he went to the bow with the rest, who went to welcome Zavala. Although we don't have time for the full account, I do want to share a couple of extraordinary claims made by Menchaca. Quote, "After Houston and his officers and also Santa Anna had held," and by the way, just to let you know, I am running out of time, so I got to finish, but just to let you know, Santa Anna was never the vice president of Mexico. He was at the Constituent Congress. He helped draft the Constitution of 1824. He was the governor of the state of Mexico. He was ambassador to Paris at the time that Santa Anna took over the government, and so he was dismissed as, so he didn't go there to earn a living. He quickly went over to the United States and then made his way down to Texas, where he had a very large impresario contract. And so he was going to actually make his living, just as many others were doing at that time, with land sales. So anyway, although we don't have time for a full account, I do want to share a couple of extraordinary claims made by Menchaca. Quote, "After Houston and his officers and also Santa Anna had held long conversation with Zavala, the latter asked to see the documents which contained a record of the proceedings of the Congress of the Republic of Texas. Rusk told him that I had them and asked him to accompany him over to my quarters. Now, Menchaca had been nowhere near the government, while Zavala had been with the government. So how would Menchaca have gotten his hands on the government records? He's just told us all his baggage was lost, so where would the documents be?" Even better is Menchaca's next claim. Quote, I had gotten inside my tent when Houston asked me to show the vice president those papers already alluded to. As he was looking over them, his son, young Zavala, came into my tent with a large official paper in his hand that he handed to me. I could not at first imagine what it could be, but I found on reading it that it was a commission as Quartermaster General of the Army of the Republic of Texas. He is getting one promotion after another. To which position the court-martial had just appointed me. Quote, while I was looking at it, Seguin, my old captain, passed and saluted me, saying, "You have just been made a high officer without any more fighting to do, and I will have to leave you now, Major." I said, "Seguin, have you got orders to leave here?" And he said, yes. He was to go with Burleson's division, which Houston had then ordered to march to the Atascosito crossing. That's true. I handed the commission back to young Zavala and told him to go for me to the court-martial and say for me that I was deeply grateful for the high honor they desired to confer me, but that it was my intention to stay with my command as long as there was a bit of fighting to be done, and that I would be compelled to decline the high position of Quartermaster General. I then ordered my boy to go and saddle my horse, and I rode off without telling either Santa Anna, Almonte, Zavala, Houston, or anyone else goodbye. And I never saw Santa Anna afterwards. I had some money then, and had I accepted the position of Quartermaster General and stayed with Santa Anna, I might have been very wealthy today in my old age. I do not regret going off and losing those opportunities when I reflect that I was doing my duty to my country in its strictest and best sense, and that this is a great consolation to me now, though I am a very poor man with but meager subsistence. Menchaca was right. He was a poor man. To a large extent, The last years of his life, he had leaned heavily on his growing reputation as one of the surviving heroes of San Jacinto. With the major figures all gone from the scene and Seguin living with his sons in Nuevo Laredo, who was there to contest the stories that gave him the attention and respect that his humble circumstances otherwise would preclude? It would have taken considerable interest in exposing the old man's tales for someone to investigate whether or not he had in fact been offered the quartermaster general position. And to be clear, he had not. Colonel Almazan Houston served as quartermaster general from November 14, 1835 to March 18, 1837. Who could challenge him on any supposed conversation with Santa Anna and Zavala? How many people would have been aware that Zavala was with the government at Galveston Island and would not have needed to look at any government records when he came to visit the army at San Jacinto? While Menchaca's recollections do not make good history, they are an important testament of the growing Tejano dilemma in the late 19th century. Faced with marginalization and/or growing hostility as a group, those Tejanos who had played a role in the creation of the Republic hammered away at the sacrifices they and their people had made for Texas. Navarro and Seguin published their testaments in their lifetimes. Menchaca repeated his on the street corners, in the saloons, and in the shops of San Antonio in front of whatever audience he could gather around him. That in his stories he identified himself as both an American and as a Mexican tells us a lot about that place in between in which Tejanos found themselves then, and many continue to find themselves today. Thank you very much. So before I go get some water, I have to introduce the next speaker, Omar Valerio Jimenez. He also has a new collection that'll be coming out from Cengage. It's a scholarly textbook publisher that I also work with in the Major Problems in History series, and it's going to be Major Problems in Latino History. And he's published numerous articles and essays and book chapters. But more importantly, he comes to history having done something else for a living for a while. He actually graduated from MIT with a degree in engineering, and I guess it didn't fulfill his needs spiritually, and therefore he went back to school at UCLA for both his master's and his PhD, and we're very fortunate that he did, because here he is to tell us about the Lower Valley and the war.
Okay, well, thank you very much. First, I want to thank the San Jacinto Symposium Committee for inviting me, and I want to tell you that I feel it's great to be back at Ripley House. Many decades ago, I volunteered here as an after-school tutor. When I was an engineer, I was working at Baylor College of Medicine, just a few miles away, and had a great experience, and I'm really glad to see how much it's changed. So today my talk, and I should also mention that it feels a little daunting to be speaking between two greats of Texas history, De La Teja and Crisp, but I'm going to try my best. And also to be in the presence of Dr. Tijerina and Roll. But so in case I'm nervous, it's because of these guys up front there. So my talk today is going to focus on the Villas del Norte, which today make up some of the towns along the Texas-Mexico border. I will be describing the reactions of local residents to Mexico's central government during the Texas Revolution, or as Raul Ramos said, the Texas Secession. Now, before describing their reactions, I would like to emphasize that these residents of the Villas del Norte did not really consider themselves Tejanos in 1836, nor are they going to consider themselves Tejanos after the Texas Rebellion, because the Villas del Norte remain outside of Texas's jurisdiction. So they're not really going to consider themselves or identify as Tejanos until later in the 19th century when the U.S. annexes the rest of Texas, or Texas and the rest of, and basically fulfills Texas's claim to have control over all the way down to the Rio Grande. Now, in order to understand the reactions of the residents of the Villas del Norte during the Texas Rebellion, I need to give you some background on these river towns. And so as I give you this background, you'll see that some of the patterns that emerged during the colonial period, in other words, before Mexico's independence, they're going to continue and they're going to hurt Mexico's efforts to quash the Texas Rebellion or the Texas Revolt. Now, the colonization of Nuevo Santander, here we go, begins as a defensive measure against foreign encroachment. The colonists of Nuevo Santander come mainly from Nuevo León and Coahuila. They are led by José de Escandón, who proposes a different approach to colonization. He proposes that the colonization of Nuevo Santander depend heavily on civilians and depend less on presidial soldiers and missionaries, which he argued and other people agreed were more expensive to maintain. So these civilian military colonists that colonize all throughout Nuevo Santander are going to establish about 23 towns between 1748 and 1755. They're organized into 4 groups, with the Villas del Norte being the uppermost group, which is the Villas del Norte translates into northern towns. They're along the Rio Grande. Anyway, in the 18th and 19th century, or in the 18th century, the Villas del Norte were very isolated and geographically distant from central New Spain. Few Spanish colonists, compared to other portions of New Spain, lived in the Villas del Norte. It had minimal commerce. So these towns really seem unimportant to the Spanish imperial goals. Yet, I argue in my book that these towns became very significant to the Spanish crown's strategic goals of claiming this territory ahead of other European rivals and ahead of, later, of American colonial interest. Initially, the goals of the Spanish colonial state and the goals of the colonists coincided. The colonists needed the colonial government support and protection. In turn, the vecinos, that's what they call themselves, or literally vecinos means neighbors, but it's the colonists, Spanish colonists, fulfilled the critical role as agents of the colonial government. They helped establish towns all along from Guerrero down to Matamoros, initially called Refugio, the other Refugio in Texas. They also laid claim to the land for the Spanish crown, and they developed the livestock industry, which became the main economic activity in the area for quite a long time. The Spanish colonial government also expected the Spanish colonists to pacify and conquer the region's indigenous populations. The colonial state, in turn, provided several benefits to them as what I called privileged subjects. They provided them military protection from Indian attacks. They provided monetary compensation, supplies, land, and initially, tax exemptions for the first settlers. The colonists of Nuevo Santander were both livestock producers and volunteer soldiers. So they had both civilian and military roles. Now, the key to understanding their sort of relationship with the colonial government, the Spanish colonial government, is that as long as the colonial authorities provided land, provided supplies, tax exemptions, and additional military assistance, then the vecinos are going to remain loyal and are going to be willing to comply with royal orders. And so when the colonial government, and then later the national government, Mexico's national government, cannot provide these things, that's when you're going to see the vecinos from the Villas del Norte start to grumble and start to complain and to act in ways that are perhaps seen as not as loyal. The colonial government tried to obtain the residents' loyalty in various ways, but basically they wanted to shape society through their political and economic policies. Yet the economic and political disagreements that actually emerged little by little are going to start splitting apart the Villas del Norte from the colonial government. The disagreements basically centered on the vecinos' perception of their central government as unresponsive to their needs. The residents in particular wanted 3 things: protection from Indians, regional autonomy, and policies that would stimulate commerce in the region. And those are the three things that the colonial government keeps failing to give them, to provide for them. So the period that, the first period I want to talk about is the period when the region is what I would call an isolated Spanish borderland. From the 1749, from the founding of these Villas del Norte, till about 1810, which is when Mexico independence movement begins. The government's economic policies, the colonial government's economic policies created some of the first divisions between the Villas del Norte and the colonial government. The Spanish mercantile system restricted trade with foreign countries and required their trade goods to pass through official ports so that the government could impose tariffs. For the Villas del Norte, the nearest port at the time was Veracruz. So everything had to come through Veracruz and everything had to exit through Veracruz. However, the Spanish mercantile system benefited large merchants in distant capitals, but made imports in the Villas del Norte as well as in other parts of the New Spain's northern frontier very, very expensive. And they also made them very scarce. Because it took a long time for these manufactured goods to come through Veracruz. So in the late 18th and 19th century, the lack of commerce and the persistent Indian attacks by groups like the Comanches and the Lipan Apaches raiding from the north are going to be the main obstacles preventing the Villas del Norte's population from increasing and preventing their commerce from flourishing. During this period, the vecinos of these northern towns began complaining to colonial authorities that their export trade was languishing because of the high cost of transporting their livestock to Veracruz and other products to Veracruz. So they continuously asked officials, colonial officials, to open a port, an official port at Refugio, which would later become Matamoros. But every request that they sent was denied by Central Mexico or just ignored. The official trade restrictions led the vecinos to engage in smuggling and to begin to view the colonial government as unresponsive to their needs. So it's not surprising that the contraband trade becomes very common during this period, and that smuggling activities actually are carried out not just by elite vecinos, prominent vecinos, but also by some foreigners. There's French immigrants, there's Anglo-Americans that are moved to the area, and are some of the most prominent smugglers. And the smuggling that's going on is actually coming, going from the U.S. or portions of Texas down into Mexico. The official trade restrictions basically were very damaging to the Villas del Norte. And the Villas del Norte, like people living in other borderlands throughout the world, basically find ways to get around them. And the way they get around them is by smuggling. This smuggling also led the Villas del Norte to establish closer trade ties with the U.S., with merchants in the U.S., because that's where they're getting their smuggled goods from. But most significantly for our purposes today, the northern towns, these river towns, they become dependent on American manufactured goods. And this is going to play a very significant role in the Villas' reaction to the Texas Rebellion. So the next period I want to speak about is the period of the Mexico struggle for independence from 1810 to 1821. Economic and political disagreements become worse during this period between the economic disagreements between the Villas del Norte and the Mexican central government. Some rebellious activities occurs in the Villas del Norte. There's a few sort of rebellions, but those are quickly put out. And most battles actually during Mexico's independence movement actually occur outside of the Villas del Norte. Yet, the Villas del Norte are affected by the colonial government's efforts to collect money and supplies for its soldiers. And these efforts further distance the residents of the Villas from the central government. And I'm going to speak a little bit about that, and you're going to start seeing the patterns, and they're just going to repeat themselves over and over. So during the 11 years of the independence struggle, financial and material support became crucial for New Spain's central government, especially the financial and material support that they were getting or they were trying to get from places like the Villas del Norte. Why? Because Spain had mounting debts from the wars that they had conducted in Europe during the previous 2 decades. Another reason is because regional treasuries throughout New Spain, throughout what is today Mexico, stopped remitting revenues because they needed to use their money to basically support local military expenditures. And in response then, the central government, New Spain's central government, starts imposing new duties on manufacturers, on food, on commercial transactions. It also increased taxes on property and on individual wealth. These are what they call contribuciones militares. These measures, as you would imagine, angered many residents, especially when the central government did not supply them with military protection against Indian attacks. So one of the things that you see, and I basically, in my research, I looked at archives from the Spanish colonial period as well as the Mexican national period throughout the Villas del Norte, but principally in Matamoros, in Reynosa, and some in Camargo and in Laredo. And what you see is just continuous complaints from the alcaldes, from the ayuntamientos, from the city councils, about how much the central government is sort of disappointing them in many ways, the colonial government, and then this is going to continue into the Mexican national period. So the central government will send out notices, requests, orders, asking for a wide range of supplies for their wide range of supplies for their military. They ask for volunteers. They ask for monetary contributions to the military, and this is all to quash the independence movement. The colonial government also will ask each town for a list of the livestock owned by each vecino in order to calculate how much each town is supposed to contribute. And what happens is that these donations of livestock are going to cut into the vecino's profit. But actually, the thing that they resent the most is when they have to donate corn or other kinds of grain, because corn wasn't grown in sufficient quantities in the region. So they had to, whenever they had to donate to the military, they had to use up their sort of supplies of imported corn. And so, and they couldn't really grow that. Meat was plentiful because it was a livestock producing area. So between 1810 and 1821, the economic strain on the Villas del Norte was quite intense. I'm going to give you a few examples. The national government, for example, asked the town of Mier, the residents there, to house and feed soldiers, to provide volunteers, to provide muleteers, to offer loans of firearms and tools, and even to repair the military's firearms. These soldiers that are traveling, New Spain soldiers are traveling through the river towns on their way to Béjar, to San Antonio. Refugios residents are asked to donate food, to donate livestock, to donate salt from nearby salt mines. But once again, these contributions deplete the town's supplies. So the vecinos, the alcaldes from all these villas, as well as the ayuntamientos, continuously complain about how they're having to make these mandatory contributions. And not only that even after they make these mandatory contributions, the military, New Spain's military, also engages in theft. So they, in addition to getting these contributions, they also steal things from the vecinos. So the civilian officials also complain about the soldiers' disorderly conduct. The soldiers act like other soldiers when they're taking a break. They act in unruly fashion. They engage in fights with civilians. They engage in theft and in drunken behavior. So the pressures on the Villas del Norte worsen because the Villas del Norte sort of go through an economic depression as a result of drought, as a result of Indian attacks, and in general, these things lead to depopulation. So beginning in 1814, this drought basically lowers their agricultural yields throughout the river towns, which leads to food shortages. The colonial government also repeatedly fails to respond to the Villas del Norte's request for assistance to protect the towns against the Comanche attacks and the Lipan Apache attacks, because it's preoccupied. The local colonial government is preoccupied with fighting the insurrection. And the Indian attacks sort of have a really damaging effect on the villas, as they would, in other parts of Texas, because it keeps the vecinos from rounding up their livestock, and it also keeps them from doing some of the agricultural work that they need to do. So in 1819, for example, the Laredo officials say that many of the ranches in Laredo are being abandoned because the residents want to stay in town and they don't want to go out to the rancho because they're afraid of Indian attacks because the military is not providing protection. So one of the things that we start seeing is that the residents start subverting the government efforts to collect and enforce collections. So one of the things they do is they hide from census takers. Why do they do this? To avoid giving the government information on the number of people that live in the town and on the material contributions that might be required of them. By this time, the vecinos are no longer privileged subjects because they're enjoying very few benefits from the colonial government. So instead, the vecinos, these town residents, feel very overburdened by the monetary and material demands from the colonial government. So Mexico's independence occurs in 1821, as we know, and Mexico's independence leads to this sort of newfound hope throughout the Villas del Norte and throughout other parts of the borderlands that things are going to change. And one of the things that does change for Matamoros and for the Villas del Norte is that legal trade expands. So the residents of the villas had been asking for a port. Well, it finally occurs in the 1820s. An official port is opened in Matamoros, which leads to a population boom. You have the arrival of foreign merchants, many Americans from New Orleans, from New York City, which are basically the main trading partners of Matamoros. These were the main trading partners during the time that the vecinos were engaging in contraband trade. So once it becomes official, these continue to be the main trading partners. The region's economy surges with this increased trade, and the economy gets transformed from being a livestock-producing region to one devoted more to commerce. And the region's workers also benefit by obtaining better-paying jobs. The national government becomes more dependent on taxes and on duties collected at the customs house in Matamoros, and the army presence in the Villas del Norte grows because the military is sent to Matamoros to protect the customs house and to prevent the residents from smuggling. Okay. So what happens during the Texas Revolution? Well, tensions between the Villas and the Mexican national government now grow worse. One of the things that continues to occur is that the central government, now it's the Mexican national government instead of the colonial government, continues to ask for volunteers, continues to ask for monetary contributions, and continues to appeal to the residents to volunteer for the military. The Villas complain, we don't have enough people to send, to provide volunteers. And the central government basically, their efforts to obtain volunteers, to obtain contributions, begins to fail for similar reasons that the previous government, the colonial government, had failed. Because the residents grow tired of these requests, repeated requests, and they also don't see any benefits to their contributions. During 1835 and 1836 in particular, the vecinos complain about the quantity of livestock that they're asked to contribute and about the frequency of their request. So the military also creates additional problems for them. One of the things that happens is that there's a lot of tension between military officials and civilian officials. As an example, let me give you an example. There's a custom house official based in Matamoros. He's a non-local, he's appointed by Mexico City, and one of the things he does is he appropriates the residents' horses. He jails residents without the mayor's approval. He forces the mayor to sign sign indictments against suspected smugglers. So this is the kind of tension that gets created between civilian officials and military officials. In addition, you have soldiers who are taking supplies without permission. So they commandeer canoes and boats to transport troops. The local alcaldes, they begin to complain to the military, to local military. They can complain to their superiors, to their government, to their governor, to Mexico City about what's going on, to no avail. So Matamoros' alcalde, for example, says, look, I don't have enough people to make these contributions, and those who do make the contributions, those residents in Matamoros who are making the contributions, they're doing so very, very grudgingly. So throughout the Villas del Norte, alcaldes are sending these basically letters, very angry letters, saying, look, you're asking too much from us, and we're contributing, we're basically serving as a defense, as the northern defense against Indian attacks, and you're not necessarily giving us, supplying us with military protection. So the residents continue to subvert the government's efforts to collect taxes. They hide their property, they hide themselves. Local alcaldes start ignoring orders. So the tensions between the central government and the Villas del Norte basically just increase during the Texas separatist revolt. The Villas del Norte become very important to the national government during this time. Why? Because the revenue collected at the customs house in Matamoros is very significant for the national treasury. The national government also uses the port at Matamoros to land soldiers on their way to sending them to San Antonio. So Matamoros and Laredo become way stations for soldiers traveling to Texas. So the Villas del Norte become important economically and geographically for the central government. And yet, at this time, these tensions that are created by the military's abuse, by the continuous request, basically alienate the residents at the time when Mexico really needs their support, to quash the rebellion. And the residents of the Villas del Norte get very alienated from the central government. So while the Villas del Norte didn't necessarily provide direct aid to the rebels in Texas, their actions and their refusal to help Mexico's military indirectly helps the Texas insurgents by hindering Mexico's efforts to suppress the rebellion. The vecinos' experience during the Texas secession movement demonstrated their increasing distance from the national government and the continued importance of their regional identity. So during the Texas Rebellion, the military issues that occur are all too familiar: requests for livestock, for food, for volunteers. The military continues to abuse local residents, and their abuses become more blatant, more frequent. Dr. Roll mentioned earlier Colonel Domingo Ugartechea. He makes takes several actions in Laredo when he's in Laredo that just completely angers the local residents. He takes their horses and leaves his troops' old horses without providing the proper payment. In some cases, local military officials order local women to bake them some goods, bake them bizcochos, and then not only do they do that, but they say, the military officials will say, if you don't bake them in the right way, we don't like them, we're going to fine you. So they're really arrogant in many ways, and so they're really alienating the population in general. The alcaldes, as I mentioned before, they complain repeatedly to their national government to no avail. And they also complain that basically they're providing contributions, and then on top of that, the military is taking those contributions and then also stealing from them. So it's just an incredible tension that's occurring. Laredo's alcalde at one point, Basilio Benavides, writes that local residents are actually on the verge of just giving up their livestock production and abandoning the town because of so much theft that the military is engaging in. So in addition to the sort of civilian and military tensions between civilian and military officials, there's also tension between soldiers and civilians. So not only are officials in disagreement, but sort of local people are also in disagreement with the soldiers. Now, what accounts for these tensions? Well, one of them is that the soldiers that are being recruited or being conscripted into the Mexican army are not necessarily the best residents to be soldiers. Some of them are criminals, some of them are vagabonds that are forcibly recruited into the military. Elite vecinos throughout Mexico basically many times purchase military exemptions. So the soldiers actually don't have the best reputations. And they're not necessarily the most tactful as well. The national government is also basically adds to the problems that the soldiers are facing because many times they're unable to feed them, they're unable to clothe them or to equip them, so the morale suffers. So fights between soldiers and civilians occur very frequently throughout the Villas del Norte, but especially in Matamoros. And these confrontations occur for various reasons. They occur when soldiers steal, goods from the vecinos. They occur when soldiers get drunk and pick fights. And they occur also when fights break out over the affection of women at dances. So that's been going on for years as well, right? Civilian officials are angered many times also when soldiers get arrested by civilian officials and then invoke their fuero, their privilege, to be tried in a military court. So not only do soldiers claim this fuero, but their wives and their children also claim this fuero to be tried in military court. So military officials actually rarely agreed to allow these soldiers to be tried in a civilian court, and this angers residents and it angers civilian officials because oftentimes the military courts side with the soldiers. So, residents know that these soldiers are engaged in fights, are engaged in theft, and they're not being punished. So now, one of the things I found in doing research for my book is that not all the residents are actually upset at the military, and not all residents sort of resent the military. There's sort of a class division of sorts. Throughout the northern towns, there are indebted workers who actually work for rancheros. They work in households as well. And these are workers who basically owe a debt to their employer, and the way they're going to pay off their debt is through working. Well, one of the things that occurs is when the military comes into town, these workers see an opportunity to leave their employment and to leave their debt by joining the military. So once again, things don't really change much. There's, people throughout the U.S. now joining the military to escape for their debts in some sorts, although they're not indebted workers. The other thing that happens is that female servants that work in households, some of them are indebted as well, they escape their debts by marrying soldiers, and then their husbands basically pay off their debt. So one of the things that happens is employers throughout the Villas del Norte start trying to prevent their servants from interacting with soldiers so that they don't run off. And this departure in general, this departure of workers, indebted workers and female servants from the towns and the ranchos throughout the Villas del Norte actually angers really wealthy vecinos and just adds to the resentment that they feel. Local officials actually, their defiance and their sort of angry letters actually become just sort of, this defiance becomes much more brazen, and their resistance much more damaging during this time. The alcaldes write angry letters. They call the military despots. To make matters worse, in some cases, the national government says, look, issues orders to the towns and says, you shouldn't provide supplies to the military unless you get paid for it, unless the military pays for it beforehand. And the alcaldes almost respond as, they think of this as an insult because they think, well, we're trying to do that, but there's no way that we can do that because the military officials will say, we need this because it's a war necessity and we're just going to take it, regardless of whether you let us do it or not. So during the 1835-1836 period, the region's economy suffers greatly for three principal reasons. The Texas Rebellion cuts off supply ships to Matamoros. Local residents become too frightened of the military to travel and to take care of their ranches and to take care of their agricultural fields. And then these two reasons basically create food shortages and supply shortages. Let me skip around here. So the vecinos continue to engage in ways of sort of trying to subvert the military and then their government's orders. They try to hinder, in any way possible, recruiting efforts. Local residents begin to hide from the military. The military wants to recruit them into the infantry, and they are very, skillful with horses, and so they actually respond and say, we'll volunteer, but we want to volunteer into the cavalry, but those requests are ignored. Entire towns during this period basically start refusing to help the military. From Laredo to Mier to Reynosa, the city councils start ignoring orders. Municipal officials stop providing housing for visiting military because the military refuses to pay rent. In other cases, after their lease expires, the military or the soldiers refuse to leave their houses, these rental houses. And then the vecinos actually even end up starting to help deserters, army deserters. So even though there's this tension between the soldiers and civilians, the civilians realize that some of these soldiers are poorly paid, they're not provided with equipment and so forth. So when they run away, even though there are, the military says, we'll offer rewards if you capture runaway soldiers. They also say we'll offer rewards or we'll punish you if you help runaway soldiers. The residents of the villas actually help them in many ways to escape. And all of this to explain that the local residents during the Texas secession movement were not really concerned with what was going on in Texas as much as they were concerned with protecting their own towns from Indian attacks. Their regional identity remained stronger than their national identity. They remained more attached to their town, to the town of Mier, to the town of Refugio, or Matamoros by this time, than to the Mexican nation. So in conclusion, the Villas del Norte emerged from the Texas Revolution politically and emotionally very distant from their central government. The outbreak of the Texas Rebellion increases the disagreements, the old disagreements that had been there, because these old issues reemerge. Principally, the central government's failure to provide protection from Indian attacks, while repeatedly ignoring the vecinos, asking the vecinos for contributions of supplies and volunteers. The economy of the Villas del Norte plummets because of the military abuses and also because of the threat of Indian attacks, and not just the threat, actual Indian attacks. By this time, as I mentioned before, the vecinos are very dependent, heavily dependent on American manufactured goods. So they're very willing to trade with U.S. merchants. And they become very weary of the Mexican national government's efforts to exact, taxes and to appeal to their sort of patriotic desires to volunteer. Just give you an example. After the Texas Rebellion, the Mexican military becomes very angry at Laredo's residents and issues a really scathing report, accusing them of traveling to Texas with their livestock to purchase supplies. The military accuses Laredo's residents of treason because they're trading with the enemy and they're also recognizing the independence of Texas. And to me, having studied the Villas, this is not surprising because they are interested in self-preservation, and they're interested in gaining supplies, and the cheapest supplies and the most bountiful supplies come from Texas and from the Americans. So the Spanish colonial government and the Mexican national government both attempted to obtain the allegiance from the Villas del Norte, but they both also neglected to truly understand the social and economic realities of the villas. I describe this in my book, and I'm learning from my elders to shamelessly plug. Here it is. I describe this in my book on Chapter 3, River of Hope. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer your questions later during the question and answer period.